Morning, everyone. I am Sarah Ryan. I am the fourth grade Ignite teacher here at Sycamore Trails, and I'm so excited to read the chapter 11 from The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind to you today. The title of the chapter is The Windmill Comes to Life. I hope you enjoy it. The following afternoon, I began assembling the machine. I dragged the bicycle, tractor fan, blades, bolts, and dynamo outside and arranged them along the dirt. I'd chosen an area behind the kitchen, which doubled as my laboratory. The acacia tree provided plenty of shade against the mid-morning sun, and I'd also determined it was the ideal place to catch the eastern winds that rushed over the highlands from the lake. The first thing I wanted to do was connect the blades to the tractor fan. This called for a drill. So I went into the kitchen and stuck the cob-handled nail into the fire. And once it glowed hot, I bored a square pattern of 4 holes into the top of each plastic blade, plus 2 more in the center. This process of heating, melting, and reheating took nearly 3 hours. Next, I emptied the sack of nuts and bolts that Gilbert had given me onto the ground and started to fasten the first blade. That's when I realized I'd forgotten the washers. Ah, I shouted, frustrated with myself. Well, I definitely needed washers to secure the bolts, so I spent the next hour collecting bottle caps outside of Fessy Boozing Center. Once I had about 20, I hurried home, hammered them flat, and used a nail to poke a hole through their middles. Perfect. One by one, I drove bolts through each washer and tightened the nuts until all 4 blades were connected. Lastly, I wanted to make sure the blades were strong and wouldn't snap in a heavy wind, so I wired 3-foot bamboo reinforcements to each one to where they acted like bones. Okay, now, I said, let's have a look. I stood back to examine my work. From end to end, the wingspan of the blade stretched more than 8 feet, causing me to giggle with excitement. It was then that I noticed the compound was empty. My sisters were off running errands, and my father was attending a funeral in a nearby village. Besides my clinking and hammering, the only other noise was my mother humming to herself in the kitchen as she prepared a pot of beans for our supper. The privilege of privacy was mine, and I fell into deep concentration. The next thing was to figure out how to connect everything to the bicycle, which wasn't going to be easy. I started by steadying the blades atop 4 tall bricks, like how a mechanic puts a car on blocks, so I would have some room to work underneath. Then came the hard part. The bicycle was not only heavy, but cumbersome, especially with a giant shock absorber sticking out from the crankset. But I managed to lift it high enough to flip it over, then dropped the shock absorber into the center hole of the tractor fan. Quickly, I crouched down underneath the bricks and jammed a cotter pin through the other end, locking it tight. Finally, I attached the dynamo to the bike frame so its metal wheel hugged against the sidewall of the tire. I strung the chain, which was coated in warm, black grease, over the crankset and made sure it held tight against the sprockets. By the time I finished the chain, the sun was setting behind the trees, and soon it would be too dark to work. I packed my tools away in my room, then moved the windmill against the wall of the kitchen and out of the way. I drew a bucket of water from the well and heated it for my bath, and after bathing, headed inside for supper. By then, my sister Rose had returned from the shops and saw me in the courtyard. "William, we haven't seen you all day," she said. "People in the trading center were asking about you." "Well, today your brother was busy," I said. "I told them you were playing with your metals to make power." "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just wait. Soon you'll be in for a surprise, along with everyone else." I ate my supper like a real working man, saying nothing except to utter a few well-orchestrated grunts. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, lay down on my bed, and was asleep in seconds. Following morning, I was awake at first light and ready to continue. My plan was to build a tall wooden tower for the windmill, but first I had to see if it even worked. For this, I needed something temporary. So I found a thick piece of bamboo more than 6 inches wide and bored a hole through the top, then drove the other end into the dirt. I finished just in time to see Jeffrey ride up on his bicycle from Chimpa. It happened to be his day off, and he was coming to visit me. "Eh, man, just in time," I said. Is this the same project you were working on? Yeah, this is everything. I'm glad you're here, friend. Help me lift this thing. We locked up the bicycle wheel and chain to keep them from spinning, then carefully hoisted the machine into the air. I was out of rope, so once it felt sturdy, Jeffrey secured it using long strips from an inner tube. Shall we? He asked. We shall. Jeffrey unlocked the tire so the blades could spin, except we didn't realize how quickly this would happen. In Malawi, the wind is never still. Within seconds, the blades were spinning so fast, the chain snapped in half and the pole nearly tipped over. Hold it, I shouted. Jeffrey and I barely managed to catch the machine before it crashed to the ground and broke apart. Once we had a grip, I twisted the pole and turned the blades out of the wind's direction. Then I spent the next 2 hours fixing the chain. The main reason for the test was to see if the dynamo produced enough current. I already knew it could power a small bicycle lamp, but what else? I went to my father's room and grabbed his international radio, which was forbidden to me, given my history with the family's other electronics. When I returned, Jeffrey gave me a look. Does your father know you're borrowing this? He asked. I waved him off. He's in the trading center. He'll never know it's gone. I jammed the dynamo's 2 wires into the radio's AC socket, and Jeffrey unlocked the windmill blades. They began to twirl, and the dynamo's metal wheels zipped against the spinning tire. For the slightest moment, I heard music. It worked. But a second later, black smoke started to pour out of the speakers. Oh no, Jeffrey said, and ripped out the wires. The radio sat on the ground between us, sizzling like an egg. He spun around looking for my father, but I was too excited to care. Did you see that power? I screamed, jumping up and down. Did you see it? The radio blew up because the dynamo produced too many volts of electricity. Voltage, as I learned in my books, is how you measure electrical pressure. Think of it like the water pressure coming out of a hose. The dynamo produced 12 volts when someone was pedaling like normal. This was enough for a radio or light bulb to manage. But when the wind gusted and spun the blades like mad, it caused a power surge that increased the voltage and fried my father's radio. I had to figure out how to reduce it. I flipped through explaining physics to where it showed a diagram of 2 separate light bulbs, both being lit from a low 12-volt AC supply, exactly like my dynamo. Both bulbs were connected by long wires. One bulb burned very bright, all because of something called a transformer, which boosted the voltage and made it stronger. But the second bulb didn't have a transformer and glowed dim and yellow. That's because without the transformer, power was lost in the form of heat on its journey through the wires, something called dissipation. Mr. Jeffrey, I said, since energy can be lost in the wires when traveling long distances, perhaps we could try this on the dynamo. I went into our pile of radio parts and found an old motor. I cracked it open, removed the core, and unwound the long copper wire. I then wrapped it around a stick, creating my own kind of reverse transformer. I attached one end of the wire to the dynamo and the other end to my father's radio, which somehow managed to survive the power surge. Just like in the book, I was giving the electricity an extra long road to travel, hoping some of its voltage would get lost along the way. Okay, try it again, I said to Jeffrey. He unlocked the blades and the wheel and dynamo began to whirl. This time, there was only music. Our test was complete. The windmill sat on the bamboo pole for 2 days, hidden behind the house and out of sight. In the meantime, Jeffrey, Gilbert, and I set out to build a real tower. The 3 of us met in front of my house one morning with our panga machetes and walked into the blue gum forest. It was the same grove of trees where I'd sought refuge from the bubblegum curse and where I had accepted Shabani's magic, only to be beaten that day in Dawa. And now it was where I want to build my ladder to science. We walked through the forest, looking carefully at each tree. Finally, we chose one that was about 18 feet high. We tore into the trunk with our blades, and after 10 minutes, the tree crashed to the ground. We used our pangas to prune the branches, then stripped the thin bark with our hands. By 3 o'clock, we'd felled and cleaned 2 additional trees and were hoisting them onto our shoulders, headed home. Just behind the kitchen, we set the poles deep into the ground, each one the same distance from the other. Each pole was wrapped in jumbo bags to keep out the termites. We took smaller branches and nailed them sideways like rungs of a ladder using nails that Jeffrey had bought using his pay from the maize mills. By sundown, the tower was complete. It stood 15 feet high and was remarkably sturdy. However, from just a short distance away, its long and spindly legs gave it the appearance of a wobbly giraffe. Get some sleep, gents, I said. Tomorrow, we raise the machine. I could barely sleep that night and was out the door before the rooster even crowed. When I rounded the kitchen, Gilbert and Jeffrey were already standing by the tower. Look who decided to sleep late, Jeffrey said. I was so happy to see them. The windmill's frame weighed about 90 pounds, and the only way to hoist it up the tower was by rope and pulley. I didn't have any rope, so I had to borrow my mother's wire clothesline instead. I fastened one end to a crude handle and I'd made on the windmill from a piece of bamboo. I climbed the tower with the other end and looped it over the top rung, then dropped it down to Gilbert. From where I stood, I could see over the trees to where the patchwork of fields and forest joined the highlands. Okay, Gilbert, I yelled, bring it up. Slowly, he began to pull. The bamboo handle lifted in the air, followed by the large, gangly frame. Easy now. Jeffrey stood below me on a lower rung to guide the machine as it climbed. The three of us now pulled with all our strength. Come on, guys, I shouted. Let's see those muscles. I'm pulling as hard as I can, said Gilbert, straining under the weight. Don't let it slip, Jeffrey. With each pull, the windmill lurched sideways and banged its cumbersome blades against the wood. A couple of times they got stuck in the rungs and Jeffrey had to knock them loose. Little by little, it made its way up the tower. After half an hour, we finally had it close to the top. When it came within reach, I grabbed the handle and screamed to Gilbert, tie it down. Gilbert looped the wire around the base pole and the windmill held. Jeffrey joined me at the top to secure the machine in place. The day before, we drilled 2 holes in the wooden poles. My hot nail drill wasn't big enough, so I had to use flat bolts instead, a process that took hours. We'd also asked Mr. Godson to cut 2 matching holes in the bicycle's crossbar with his welding gun. Standing atop the tower, Jeffrey fished the nuts and bolts from his pocket while I held the frame and tried to align the holes. I could feel it slipping. Hurry, this thing is heavy, I said. Jeffrey slid in the bolts and tightened them with the wrench. Once everything was fastened, we looked at each other and smiled. The machine felt sturdy and very strong. While Jeffrey made his way down the tower, I remained atop my perch to take in the scenery. To the north, I could see the iron sheet roofs of the trading center and the rows of brown huts that sat behind the market. As I admired the view, I noticed something strange. A line of people had emerged and were heading in my direction. They must have seen the tower from the distance and were curious to have a look. We have visitors, I said. Within minutes, a dozen people gathered at the base and gazed up at the machine. I recognized a few of them as traders and shopkeepers. One was named Calino. What is this thing? He asked. Since there's no word in Chichua for windmill, I use the phrase Majesti Amefo, electric wind, I answered. What does it do? Generates electricity from the wind. That's impossible, Calino said, laughing. He turned to get a reaction from the crowd. It looks like a radio tower. And what kind of silly toy is that? Well, I said, just stand back and watch. I climbed down from the tower and ran into my room for the final piece. That morning, I'd found a thick reed and cut a section about 10 inches long. I then wrapped a long copper wire around the base of a headlamp bulb and strung it through, creating a light socket. Holding the socket and bulb, I climbed the tower and connected their wires to the ones from the dynamo. As I worked, more and more people arrived and I could hear their chatter. What do you suppose he's doing now? Asked a farmer named Banda. This is the Minsala from the scrapyard my children were talking about, another man answered. Think about his poor mother. Peering out, I saw my parents and sister at the back of the crowd. Their eyes were wide and their jaws hung slightly open, the way some soccer fans look when clustered around a radio. Except this time, it was me who had the ball with only seconds left on the clock. My hands trembled from nerves, but I was confident. I'd prepared for this for months. "Let's see how crazy this boy really is," I heard someone shout. A steady wind whistled through the tower, mixing the smells of chain grease and melted plastic. Even though the wheel remained locked, the machine groaned against the breeze as if begging me to release it. I looked down at Gilbert and Jeffrey and nodded. Here it goes, I thought. I jerked the wheel loose and the blades began to spin. The chain snapped tight against the crankset and the tire slowly turned. Everything happened in slow motion. "Come on," I said. "Don't embarrass me now." Just then, a strong gust flung me backward. The tower began to rock so much that I wrapped my elbow around a rung just to hang on. Inches above my head, the blades began to buzz like a set of angry propellers. I clutched the bulb, waiting for my miracle. Then it came. A flicker, a flash, then a burst of bright, magnificent light. My heart nearly exploded. "Look," someone shouted. "He made light." "It's true what he said." A group of children pushed through the crowd. "Look how it spins. Let's see." I threw my hands into the air and shouted with joy, laughing so hard that I became dizzy. I held the bulb in triumph and addressed the unbelievers. "Electric wind," I shouted. "I told you I wasn't mad." One by one, the people began to cheer. They waved their hands and shouted, "Wachu Wabina, well done. You did it, William." "That's right," I said. "And now I'm going bigger. Just wait and see." The crowd shouted questions, then gathered around Gilbert and Jeffrey, grilling them for details. Those two guys couldn't stop grinning. I stayed on the tower, listening to the blades and taking in the scene. I finally came down when the bulb started to burn my hand. My wire wasn't long enough to use the bulb anywhere but the windmill. So late in the afternoon, I attached it to the top rung and left it. I was still so high from the experience that I went to the trading center to burn off some energy and relish in the glory. Once I reached the market stalls, I looked back to the valley and saw the light still flickering through the heat waves. "What is that thing?" said a man nearby, clutching a sack of tomatoes. "It's catching the wind just like a helicopter." The tomato seller was my mother's friend, Maggie. "Well, the owner is right here. Why don't you ask him?" "Is it true?" he said. "How is that possible?" I explained it to him the way I did everyone. "I still don't understand," he said. "I need to come see for myself." For the next month, about 30 people arrived each day to stare at the light. "How did you manage such a thing?" they all asked. "Hard work and lots of research," I replied, trying not to sound too smug. Many of them were traveling businessmen from other districts. To them, the windmill became a kind of roadside attraction while passing through Wimby. Other people came from outer villages with chickens and maize strapped to their bicycles. Women balancing sacks of flour on their heads stopped and spoke with my mother. "God has blessed you," one said. "You have a child who can perform wonders. You'll never complain about kerosene again." The men approached my father. "Your son made this?" "Yes." "Where did he get such ideas?" "From books." "They teach this in school?" "No, he did this on his own." That month, I helped clear the fields and prepare them for planting, working each day with joy in my heart. If I was in the fields near the windmill, I would pause in between swings of my hoe and just watch it spin. One night I was playing bow with Jeffrey and Gilbert near the barber shop when the lights went out from a power cut. While everyone was cursing the dark, I snuck home and connected the bulb, then ran back. "Oh, I hate these power cuts," a man complained, leaving the barber shop with only half a haircut. "What power cuts?" I said with a smile. "Have you chaps seen my house?" Mr. Impanga, the barber, leaned out his shop, still clutching his dead clippers. "William, I think you take pride in our power cuts just so you can boast about your electric wind." Perhaps. The next month, I started working on lighting my house using the windmill. To do this, I needed loads and loads of electrical wire, but as usual, I had no money to buy any. Then one afternoon, Gilbert and I were at Charity's house when I noticed long sections of copper insulated wire, the very kind I needed, being used as clothing line. In fact, a whole spool of the stuff sat in the corner of the room. Man, I said to Charity, how can you play around with this wire when I need it so much? Someone had given it to him as payment for Ganyu, he said. But since you're my cousin, I'll give you a discount. I was on my way to the trading center to look for a job when Gilbert pulled out 100 kwacha and gave it to Charity. Just like that, I had 30 meters of copper wire. I promise I'll pay you back, Gilbert, I said. Don't worry about it. Just put lights in your room. Once again, when all hope seemed lost, Gilbert came to the rescue. I ran towards home, clutching the heavy spool. As I flew down the trail and into the valley, I could see the windmill spinning in the distance. Now, every time I saw it, my stomach did a flip. I unspooled the wire enough to measure the distance from the windmill to my room, then clipped it with my knife. Clutching one end, I climbed the tower. A windmill in motion was a hazardous work and environment. The blades were spinning so fast, I had to be careful, or else I'd end up with a haircut. Also, the dynamo was producing real electricity. As I unhooked the bulb and attached the new wire, I was mindful not to cross them or I'd get a shock. To be extra safe, I wrapped a jumbo bag, which is plastic and doesn't conduct electricity, around the junction where the wires tied together. The roof of my bedroom was made from pallets of grass wrapped in plastic sheeting, each supported by several wooden beams. Standing on a ladder, I wrapped the wire 2 turns around the middle beam, the one nearest my bed, then popped a hole through the pallet and I lowered it down into my room. Inside, I made some final attachments, then pulled the bulb from my pocket. I may not be touching the wall to get light, I thought, thinking back to Gilbert's light switch, but this is close enough. I connected the reed and bulb, and in an instant, my room was illuminated. I ran to the door and slammed it closed, then marveled at the new electricity. For the first time ever, I had my own lighted space. That evening after supper, I lay in bed and just stared up at the bulb. It flickered yellow to the rhythm of the spinning blades outside, bright enough to read the library books I'd stacked up around me. I heard a knock at the door, and soon my family had crowded into my room. Look, it's William staying up past the dark, my father said. Congratulations, said my mother. We'd also like to have lights in our rooms. Think you can manage? Only if you're okay with having electricity generated by a madman, she laughed. You proved us all wrong in the end, but I'll admit I did worry. My sister Rose then asked, what if the wind stops blowing? It was an important question. The light will go off, I said, and I'll be stranded. That's why I have plans for getting some batteries. More specifically, I needed something like a car battery so I could store power for the times when the wind was calm. A car battery was also big enough to power the entire house. Once I had one, my family could finally toss out those kerosene lamps and live like modern people. And lights were just the first step. The next windmill would pump water for our fields and give us more food. Windmills would be our front line against hunger. That first night with light, I stayed awake reading, explaining physics, trying to prepare for my next step. I read for hours, long after everyone else was asleep, while the termites feasted on the roof and clouds of red dust pushed under the door. As usual, a strong wind was blowing. And that's the end of chapter 11. Quite an exciting chapter in the story of William and his windmill. I hope you enjoyed it, Sycamore Trails.